I first would like to get you to agree with me that humans are living in an increasingly biologically converging world. Now, to do that, I'm going to show you some graphs. The graphs are very interesting graphs. They're dynamic. They change with time, starting with 1931. They're easy to read. The x-axis is always wealth. You're going to see why it's always wealth in a moment. The y-axis is child mortality. The bubbles are different countries or regions of the world. So let's start it and see if this thing works. And what you'll see that happens is that as nations get wealthier, children survive. In fact, it's a straight line. It's one of the most amazing things about healthcare. If you want your health to be better, make more money. By the way, health and wealth don't always go together. Let me show you the next graph, because as nations get wealthier, they also put on weight. And so over time, we're getting fatter. By the way, some of these things are not so clear. They're a little more confusing. Watch this next one, which is cholesterol. This one's trickier because the rich nations are getting their cholesterol under control. Poor nations are adopting hamburgers in their diet, and it's going the wrong way. Same thing can be said for blood pressure. Again, it's amazing. We are becoming more and more similar as a species. In fact, as a species, we've crossed a line that was very interesting. It was announced in April of 2011 by the World Health Organization that in the previous year, more humans on the planet died of chronic non-communicable disease than died of infectious disease. It's an amazing triumph of vaccines and antibiotics, but it leaves us with people who are living with illness for a longer period of time. What are those illnesses? For example, it's cardiovascular disease, where we've made huge progress technically. It used to be a heart attack was a death sentence, no longer. But we still seem to be doing those things to ourselves to cause us to have heart attacks. There is, of course, cancer, in which billions and billions are being spent. And recently, some true progress has been made. Or, to me, the worst example, neurodegenerative disorders, in which destroys people's personality, who they are and what they were, and yet leaves them alive for very long periods of time. And again, in spite of billions being spent, there has been very little progress at all. Now, that's not to say that the infectious disease problem has gone away. It's not, it's just become different. Infectious disease is now very different because of two problems. First of all, an infectious disease somewhere in the world can instantly be everywhere in the world. Pandemics have never been more possible. Secondly, those infectious diseases that are local are most likely to become resistant. And so you have these two very different problems surrounding infectious disease. And the next trend that I want to make you aware of is primarily a trend in developed nations, but I include China in that group, and that is we're getting older. Again, our species is about to go through a milestone, and that is there will be more people on the planet over the age of 65 than under the age of 5. Now, that's not the only problem. The real problem is these aged people are not like the aged in the past, the passive patients who will accept whatever a physician wants to do to them. They're active, dynamic individuals who are going to question the physicians and demand care to a much higher quality than their predecessors. And there is the problem, the trend which cannot continue, because no country in the world has figured out how to bend the cost curve in the right way. This all leads me to my three big healthcare problems. They are, first, managing chronic disease in an increasingly graying world with demanding patients. Early and specific identification of infectious disease in an increasingly resistant world. And how to afford all of the stuff that's necessary to take care of it. Now, there's science. Science is terrific, and there's lots of breakthroughs happening all over the place. There's the omics resolution and new detector technologies and all sorts of personal devices. But the one thing in common of not only all the new technologies for diagnosis and characterization of the patient, but the therapies that require it, is data. Data, 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 and massive amounts of data, mind-boggling amounts of data just to describe a single human. And by the way, our knowledge of biology is making this even more difficult. 100 years ago, if you went to the physician, you were weak, anemic, pale, you had a disease of the blood. 80 years ago, you had leukemia, lymphoma. 60 years ago, there are 5 different diseases. Now, you have close to 100 different diseases of the blood. And by the way, we're curing many of these, so survival rates are going up. And this is happening in disease after disease, that we're finding it's not just one single disease, it's lots of diseases, which leads to a problem. You see, when I graduated from college, a physician graduating at the time might have to learn 1,200 diseases to know every one of them. Now it's 16,000. And that's increasing by approximately 500 a year. Good luck keeping that in your brain. It also means that blockbuster drugs are not happening anymore. We're discovering that the blockbuster drugs are no longer blockbusters unless the pharmaceutical company decides to charge a huge amount of money for a very small cohort of patients. The productivity of those pharmaceutical companies is going down. It's in fact, jokingly referred to in the industry as Eroom's law, the opposite of Moore's law. And in the diagnostic world, we've always been searching for discovering disease earlier and earlier and earlier before it becomes apparent that it's going to make you ill. But to the result that we overdiagnose many patients, leading to situations like this one in South Korea, reported on in 2014, in which it looked like there was an epidemic of thyroid cancer, although no one more was dying of it. And because there was only an epidemic of the use of ultrasound to examine the thyroid at the annual physical exam. What's happened is that we are considering that symptoms, which primarily has described patients over time, are inadequate. The people with the same symptoms may have very different underlying biologies. The trick is to find those people with the underlying biologies that are different, group them into smaller cohorts, understand their biology, and treat those. Now, this is trivial. Artificial intelligence is here, neural networks, these things will save the day, correct? How many people in the audience understand how machine learning works mathematically? Raise your hand. That's funny, but there's a couple. Now, by the way, I have no clue. But I'm very, very fortunate. And I'm fortunate because I have a son who knows everything about this stuff, and he's been waiting all his life for me to ask him to explain it to me, in which he could simply answer, "Dad, read chapter 4 of my book." Because there, he says, it's simple. There's no secret to it. It's a bunch of linear algebra. I said, "Ben, I paid for your education. Give your dad a break. Explain it to me." He says, "Okay, Dad, here's how it's going to work, and I'm going to explain it to you." He says, imagine you want to describe something. Let's say you want to describe a cat. You take all the dimensions of the cat that you can think of, the whiskers, the fur, the eyes, the hair, the ears, and you train your system to identify all of those things until all parts of the system says, that's a cat. Then you put in another cat, and you do the same thing, and you put in lots of cats, and then you do the same thing. And by the way, the other thing you must do is you must put in a lot of non-cats. And when you put in the non-cats, then you say, okay, these are all not cats, and that's great. But remember, we're describing patients primarily by their symptoms, in which case it becomes difficult. Really difficult. And you can become very confused. So I actually believe that there have been, not much talked about, but huge failures of artificial intelligence in healthcare, and it's because of data quality and verification. We need more underlying biology for it to become successful. But ultimately, it is technology that changes everything, from vaccines to antibiotics, the introduction of anesthesia. These are the things that have radically changed medicine. So what's coming? I'm going to give you a couple of examples. I could give you 5 hours worth, but I will not. Let's take, for example, a high-risk group of patients that has gastric reflux disorder or continuing pain in the stomach. They might have a high risk of esophageal cancer or gastric cancer. Now, today, how do those patients get diagnosed or screened? They're anesthetized. A large endoscope is shoved down their throat. A physician guides it around, takes a look at what they can see. They record it, and they do something about it. Imagine that you could have a way of doing this by using a pill camera, but a pill camera that doesn't tumble, but one you can control. I'm about to show you a video of the very first human trial of such a device. Here it is. You swallow it, but it's not such a big deal. And then the wonderful people in the back of the room enjoy themselves by steering it around inside your body and asking you such silly questions as, could you feel that? How about this? But it's great. And what you can see from these videos is, this is the inside of my stomach. Now, I don't share with every audience my pyloric sphincter, but with you, I felt very, very, very comfortable doing this. And it is a thing of beauty as far as I can tell. So this is something that conforms to the patient's desire for something that's much less invasive, and it's actually much less expensive. Let's look at cardiovascular disease. Remember, I told you before that the problem with cardiovascular disease is that we are now surviving heart attacks, but we're surviving heart attacks with damaged myocardia. And you want to find out where it's damaged. You want to repair that, not just transplant, which is very expensive, et cetera. But you don't want it to be unpleasant. You don't want catheters shoved in you and things like this. Well, what you could do is you could get non-invasive methods to look at your heart, as I've done, and put it into a computer model of the human heart to display something that has never been seen by humans before. This is actually the hemodynamics of my heart. No machine can make this, but a computer model can. And if my heart were damaged, it's not. I'm taking up smoking after seeing this. It's fantastic. But if it's not damaged, it's no problem whatsoever, because in Japan, they're starting to repair myocardium with sheaths of stem cells placed over the parts of the damaged myocardium. This is a sheath of stem cells, myoblasts, and they're doing what myoblasts do. They beat, which I think is an amazing thing. Now, the next problem or technical solution that I'd like to describe is a little tricky. You're going to have to pay attention to this one. Because if we're going to read those weak signals, there's a difficulty. At the earliest stages of disease, bear with me now, this is important to understand. The earliest stages of disease, the molecule that's most specific to that disease is low in abundance. Think about it. It's spitting off very few things. Now you're going to extract some blood, hope to find it. It's actually less like finding a needle in a haystack, more like finding the haystack with the needle. And therefore, you need technologies to actually find, grasp, protect, and concentrate the molecules of interest in order that you can discover them. We've actually just invested in one of these companies, and they recently were featured in the New York Times because they came out with a method to diagnose tuberculosis with almost 100% specificity from urine. Really cool stuff. Now, I told you before, neurology is the place where I have my biggest worries. It's very hard. Neurologists have a difficult life. You can't biopsy the brain easily. Most of the molecules that the brain is spitting out don't get through the blood-brain barrier. You can't see them even in the blood. And the greatest difficulty is that I mean, this is really horrible. The symptoms of neurological disorders typically have nothing to do with the disease. They're very subjective and they're qualitative. They have more to do with where it's happening in your brain rather than what is happening in your brain. So the first thing we decided to attack is let's take the qualitative, unspecific symptoms. Symptoms like, well, I'm a little more depressed today, a little less depressed. I'm hearing a few more voices, a few fewer voices. My tremor is getting better, my tremor is getting worse. And we're working on something to make it precise. That's very simple. We're just looking at neuromuscular disorders. And we're using machine learning. So here I'm going to show you a video of this device. This device is sort of cute. Let's see if I can get the video to work. Basically, the device sits on a shelf. You don't have to wear anything. You don't have to do anything. It measures your motion. It does not use video. Can't see you. Can't determine who you are, other than the fact that how you move is unique to you as a fingerprint. It can pick me out of a crowd because it's trained to identify who I am. And by the way, as it's picking me out of the crowd, it can do so in the dark. It can do so if I don different clothing. It knows who I am. And while it's knowing who I am, it is measuring all parts of my motion. My stride length, my walking speed, how I raise my hand, how fast I can stand up from a chair. All of these things are being measured without me having to do anything. Thousands and thousands of data points. We've started to deploy the technology in clinical trials. And the technology is discovering patients who are not responding to disease or to drugs before the patient even sees it. Or down below, I wrote a little during a beta test of an older woman where the system said, this woman has a severe and acute motion disorder. It's probably a stroke. Notified in 5 minutes, and this woman got therapy, all symptoms resolved. I know this case very well. That woman was my mother. This is incredible technology and starts to, again, take from general to precise. Let's go back to cancer again. Genomics has revolutionized our understanding of cancer biology. We know that if you have a treatable mutation, you will survive longer. And the drug companies are being very good at making therapies for these targets. And there are thousands of clinical trials happening today regarding them. Now, here's the problem. The problem is, as we learn more and more about cancer, we realize that cancer is a rare disease. It's a rare disease in that your cancer and your cancer, even if they're in the same organ, described in the same way by the pathologist, are likely to be different. It is highly unlikely that the patient that is sitting in front of me as an oncologist I will ever have seen or I will ever see again. It may even be true in the history of the institution. I will have not seen it. And so what do you do with this? Well, you ultimately want to have systems which can mine information not about just that patient, but across institutions, privately, not removing it from outside of their firewall, and allow the physician to do the one thing that physicians want to be able to do and say, for you, are there other patients like you? What medications were they given, and what were their outcomes? And that's what this system does. It actually mined for this particular patient, found 9,000 other patients like this woman with the same biology, and was able to plot charts of how they performed under different treatment regimens. The goal is very simple, to give every single physician the ability to become the very best physician on the planet. Now, we're talking about precision medicine. Ultimately, I believe that that's where we're going. That instead of experience-based medicine, I've seen a patient like you before, and I gave them this, they did well, to statistical or evidence-based medicine. I read about a 5,000-person study for patients like you. They seem to do best on this. To what I would call algorithm-based, where you actually have to mine the data in order to make a treatment decision. I will make my only prediction of this talk, and that is that I believe within the next 15 years, it will be malpractice in some specialties to prescribe a treatment for a patient without computer assistance. We're living in a revolutionary time. And I actually think information technologies, as was said at the very beginning, so thank you for the lead-in, it was terrific, are going to help us handle the fact that humans are phenomenally complex beings. The complexity is what makes this field delightful as well as difficult, but I think we're on the verge of a revolution that will allow us to treat patients who otherwise would never, ever be treated. I thank you very much for your attention.